So, Manchester City is going all my cousin Vinny with the Premier League. Quite a tricky situation when we're seeing some of the limited details that are out there, but let's backtrack to see how we got in this position in the first place. So, around 2019-2020, the German publication Der Spiegel released some leaked documents that insinuated that Manchester City was overinflating the value of some of their sponsorships, for example, with Etihad Airways. This is something that UEFA then ran with and came to their own conclusion in the same way, and therefore handed out a £30 million fine to Manchester City, as well as a 2-year ban with participation in UEFA competitions. Of course, Manchester City was not overly delighted with this. They had a lot of problems with the process itself, saying that some illegally obtained evidence, the emails, etc., leaked documents, shouldn't be something that is permissible in terms of this ruling. So they went to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, who then considered it and took their own verdict in the favor of Manchester City, but leaving quite some area for interpretation, grey area in terms of what the actual findings were. So essentially they said that a number of the charges were outside the statute of limitation, what they called time barred, and the rest was not really established. So the question really is, was Manchester City found innocent, or were they just found not guilty? And the suspicion of many people will then be leaning towards that latter part. So they were found at that time to be non-cooperative with UEFA, and therefore overall their punishment was a fine of 10 million, but that's all, when you balance that out with regards to participation in the Champions League and the lucrative benefits of that, it's one that they were very happy with in the end. In the meantime, the Premier League has been compiling their own dossier of financial irregularities with regards to Manchester City. The infamous now 115 charges are out there and being to be contested later on this year. Basically has a lot of things along the lines of the release of information has been misrepresented towards the Premier League by Manchester City. The cooperation has not been there. They've broken financial fair play rules in terms of their actual financial performance over the course of 3 years or so. So quite a heavy dossier that's going to be contested in court, and will have quite dramatic implications. We've already seen this year where a few clubs lower down in the Premier League have been quite penalized with points deductions, and done in a very rapid way. Obviously, the size and scale of this dossier, if most of it is proven, it's hard to see, for example, relegation not being part of it, but it'll be interesting to see what happens to, for example, historical success and titles that have been attributed to Manchester City. Now, take a break there. There's one important point when we come to net today in terms of what Manchester City has brought forward to the Premier League, and that's what happened in 2021 when Newcastle were undergoing their own acquisition by the fund from Saudi Arabia. There was a regulation put in place, voted by the majority clubs of the Premier League. I think it was 14 out of the 20 clubs voted in favour, to control the amount of valuation that a sponsorships can have within the league. So to essentially avoid a fund or an owner putting in 1 billion to be a sponsor on the front of their shirt, but to have something that's more representative of what the value is for that for that proposition. They agreed on a so-called fair market value to be established by an independent body, and that's someone who can then regulate what makes sense for a certain sponsor for a certain club. Now, in this case, I think Nielsen are the party that have been allocated this task, something that they do across different European bodies and clubs and federations, etc. Essentially, what they do is take a look at what are the eyeballs on the club across the scene, across the world, in terms of video, match day, social media, all that sort of stuff. How many people are seeing the brand, seeing the logo? How often are they seeing it? How long are they seeing it? When they see it? What markets are they seeing it in? So essentially, they can put together a methodology that puts that together and says, okay, you are seen very frequently, very often at peak periods within a very affluent market like the US. Therefore, we think that the value that a sponsor should be able to pay and return value on is X amount. Doesn't mean that you'll get that much, but it means that you can go up to that sort of level whilst being in a sort of consistent parity or in fairness with the methodology that will be applied to all the different clubs. So that's something that was voted in and has been in place for the last 3 years, so 2021. Fast forward to yesterday, where Manchester City put forward their opposition to the Premier League on a couple of fronts, mainly around this rule, where they said Firstly, the Premier League hasn't shown any evidence that we need such a regulation in place. How have they justified or showed evidence that this will cause any irregularity? Well, it could be the case that they didn't justify that in case, but it's probably pretty obvious, and we can probably build something around that that does prove that if ever, 5 clubs now have $1 billion sponsorships on front of shirts, probably that does create an inequality within the environment of the Premier League. Number two, they had a problem with the independence of Nielsen and their role in it. Okay, and number three, and the one that I find the most interesting, is the imposition of what the majority have voted on in terms of we need to do what everyone else says. So if 14 clubs out of 20 voted on this, then that doesn't mean that we should have to be forced towards obeying that. The legal terminology is tyranny of the majority, which sounds very dramatic. But in general, this is the most interesting one that questions the future of Manchester City within the participation of the Premier League. It also says, we're happy to create enemies within the league as well, because we're going to challenge the way that the rules are enforced and how they should not be enforced on us. So this is all really, really interesting. It's sort of a preemptive attack when looking down the road at what's going to come later on this year. If Manchester City can get some of these things in play on their side, then it can potentially lessen some of the severity of some of the charges that they have later on down the road. Potentially they can say, well, we did something, but now that's okay, because a lot of the charges are before 2021 and that rule coming into place. But so we did something, but potentially it's probably just bad the way that we did it. So we'll take that slap on the wrist. So it's all, an angle in terms of the bigger case that's to follow later down the line. Voila, more to follow, and let's stay tuned and see how this progresses over the next couple of weeks.